Welcome to the referendum debate. In just 15 days' time, millions of Scots will head to polling stations to cast their votes. Tonight, we're in Aberdeen. On our panel, for the Scottish National Party, a politician who's at the heart of the Yes campaign, Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. For Labour, former Secretary of State for Scotland, Jim Murphy, who's been touring the country with his Iron Brew crate and getting the occasional egg thrown at him. The former leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who now sits in the House of Lords, as well as Holyrood, Annabel Goldie, and one of the most prominent businessmen supporting independence, Brian Souter, who recently donated £1 million to the SNP. And in the interests of a good debate, our audience tonight are evenly divided between supporters of independence on one side, opponents on the other, and some who are still making up their minds at the front. Our audience have submitted their questions, and our panel have not seen them. Welcome to Aberdeen. They call it the Granite City, and the name suits Aberdeen's character as well as its style. The people here took on the North Sea and won. First it was whaling, fishing and trade, now the black gold. And while arguments rage about how much remains, Europe's oil capital is still making serious money. Aberdeen is not flashy, it does not seek the limelight, but it is right now at the heart of the referendum debate. So let's get right on with that debate with our first question, which is from Joanna Hardy.
Would an independent Scotland be less vulnerable to terrorism?
Would an independent Scotland be less vulnerable to terrorism? Jim Murphy.
I don't think the threat from terrorism is greater because we're part of the United Kingdom or whether we be independent. There are nations all over the world who are threatened by a terror and a horror that respects no religion and honours no boundary or border. And really it's about how do we keep ourselves strong and resilient. And the investment we have in our armed forces and our security services is really crucial in that. If I was to offer a criticism to the other side, it would be a mild one, which is that I think they have to do an awful lot more to think through how you would configure independent armed forces to ensure that our country stays safe and secure. But ultimately, this is one of those issues which shouldn't divide us left or right, patriot or nationalist, and we should all do what we can to keep our country as strong as possible, as secure as humanly feasible, and ensure the safety and the integrity of our nation and our well-being.
Nicola Sturgeon, would an independent Scotland be less vulnerable to the threat of terrorism?
We certainly should never assume that. There should never be any complacency in any country about the threat that we face from international terrorism. An independent Scotland, as every other country is, would require to be properly defended and properly protected against those threats. As a continuing part of the British Isles, of course, an independent Scotland, we share an island with England and Wales. There would be a massive common interest between Scotland and the other parts of the UK to continue to work together to secure our common defence and security. It's no secret that one of the big disagreements my party has had with Jim's party, and I agree with much of what Jim said there about not making this political, but one of the big disagreements was over the war in Iraq, and I certainly hope that whatever party was in government in an independent Scotland, we would be respecters of international law at all times. My last point is just to say that quite a significant intervention in the independence debate today has come from the recently retired UK ambassador to NATO, Dame Mariette Leslie, who has indicated that she herself will be voting yes in the referendum, but she makes very clear that she believes that neither an independent Scotland nor the rest of the UK would be any less safe as a result of independence. And I think given her expertise, given her experience, that's a voice we should listen to.
The question was not, would it be more vulnerable to the threat of terrorism, but would it be less vulnerable? And isn't the logic of your position that you're trying to distance yourself from the imperialist British state that gets involved in wars like Iraq, that it might be less vulnerable?
I've said, and I've said it in as reasonable a way as possible. I disagreed with the previous Labour government in terms of the war in Iraq. I hope that an independent Scotland, as I hope all countries, respect international law and work within the confines of international law and send an example to the rest of the world. But I did say at the start of my answer, I don't think any reasonable, responsible politician in any country should ever assume that we are less vulnerable than any other country to international terrorism.
Okay.
And it's important that we stress that, but that we also stress the interest of Scotland and our partners across the British Isles in working together to secure our common defence and security.
Annabel Goldie.
Maybe unexpectedly, I'm going to start by agreeing with the last part of Nicola's contribution, because I think that terrorism is a threat, whether we're within the United Kingdom or whether we're independent. Terrorism is a threat. It's a fact of the age in which we live. And I have to say, from my perspective, I do think as part of the United Kingdom we are able to do two things. I think we're able to sustain a very meaningful defence capability. We've got the fourth biggest defence budget in the world, but we're also able to share very sophisticated intelligence operations, both surveillance, in-gathering of data and information. Now, that's not to say an independent Scotland wouldn't do its best to cooperate with the rest of the UK and try and share data, share information. I just think, to be honest, that's much more readily done if we're all within the partnership of the United Kingdom, and that's one of the many, to me, attributes and opportunities and benefits we share by being in that partnership.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd love to hear from the audience, so put your hands up and I'll come to you in a minute if you have your hands up to speak. But Brian Souter.
Well, I think common sense tells me that we would be less vulnerable because you don't see the same acts of terrorism committed generally with smaller countries. And it's doubtless our kind of colonial past that makes us a target for some of the terrorists. I do agree, however, with Nicola that no one is safe from terrorism, and an independent Scotland would need to be active with its own security forces, and we need to prepare ourselves so that we could defend ourselves against terrorism.
So is Britain to blame for the terrorism that's happened here? Is that the logic? Is that the logic of where you're going there?
I don't think they're to blame for it, but my vision for an independent Scotland would be quite different in these circumstances. I believe an independent Scotland would be active with refugees in Gaza, with the Yazidi, with the Christian minority, and the persecuted. To me, our role wouldn't be like a colonial role where we're policemen. I think our role would be one as international, lining up with the compassionate folks and helping with the charities. And I think we would have a different role internationally if we were independent.
Let's take a question from the man with the beard, almost smack bang in the middle with the blue shirt. Yes.
Hi there. Can I just point out that it wasn't only at Westminster that it wasn't just international law that they disobeyed, but also the million people who marched on London and the pretty much overwhelming majority of the people of the UK.
Okay, thank you. Yes, man in the tie.
I cannot see how breaking up the UK helps us maintain our influence in the EU and the UN and other institutions across the world.
Thank you very much. And the woman near the back, yes.
Surely terrorism in its whole aspect is the fact that you're not supposed to see it coming. So if an independent Scotland did take a more maternalistic view on people who are trying to escape terrorism, then they would be more vulnerable to that sort of attack because they're going to attack the people they're already trying to get rid of elsewhere.
Okay, one more point from the man in the blue shirt near the back of the hall. Yes.
It's just with regards to general defence of Scotland. I find it a bit hypocritical to be told by the UK government that we're being defended when the current cuts have resulted in one Royal Air Force base in Scotland covering an area from Shetland all the way down to Leaming. The fact that we have no Royal Naval vessels, surface vessels based in Scotland at all, and we have no maritime reconnaissance aircraft operating out in the UK at all.
Jim Murphy, you're spending billions on Trident and not on anything useful.
You know, I don't think this issue is, first of all, it's too complicated, too intricate to reduce it to which countries were involved in the Iraq war or the Afghanistan conflict. There are nations who were involved in Iraq and who weren't, nations who are involved in Afghanistan and who aren't, who are the subject of this horrible terror that is indiscriminate in its intention and its purpose. So we
Can
shouldn't
we address
reduce
this
it
point?
to that fact.
Can we address this specific point about the priorities of defence at the UK government level? Money being spent on Trident, not being spent on the likes of maritime patrol aircraft.
I want a world free of all nuclear weapons. The fact is, this technology has been invented. We can't uninvent it. We have to try and negotiate it away. We can't put it back in the box. And the idea... The people who are against all nuclear weapons and who want to do that unilaterally, of course they're members of CND, and that's entirely noble. But the idea that we vote for independence and we move a nuclear deterrent a few miles south down the M6 and stay in a nuclear club called NATO has no deep principle about it whatsoever. So let's together try and get rid of nuclear warheads all across the planet. The last Labour government reduced the number of warheads more than any other nation on earth, and that has to continue. But and I know this is an expensive, very expensive deterrent, but in a world where India and Pakistan are facing off against one another across a nuclear divide, where Iran is trying to get the nuclear bomb, where North Korea is trying to get the nuclear bomb, I don't want to be in a world at this moment where we unilaterally give up on our deterrent when so many of these other countries are trying to acquire it.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I'll put my cards on the table. I'm against nuclear weapons in principle. I am in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament. But I'd have more sympathy with Jim's point on Trident if Westminster were in the business of trying to negotiate Trident away. But that's not the case. Westminster is in the business of spending £100 billion replacing Trident, putting a new generation of Trident nuclear weapons on the Clyde. And, you know, I agree wholeheartedly that we don't want to see countries like Iran and North Korea develop nuclear weapons of their own. I just happen to think that countries like the UK would have more credibility in saying to other countries don't have nuclear weapons if they weren't in the business of putting new nuclear weapons in their own waters.
Just to bring this back to the question, to tie that back into the question then, Annabel Goldie, how do nuclear weapons make Scotland safer from terrorism, for example?
I think it's very difficult to prove a deterrent is a deterrent, and that's exactly what we're talking about. Trident is a deterrent. All I can tell you is that in the last 6 decades, thankfully, we've not seen nuclear conflict. I totally agree with the concept that we want to try and reduce the presence of nuclear weaponry worldwide. I want to see that happening. I can tell you now you don't do that from a position of weakness. And it was very interesting to watch the attitude of democratic powers across the world with a nuclear facility when Iran was trying to develop a nuclear facility. Now, thankfully, that was constrained. It was constrained in the back of diplomatic argument, constrained in the back of knowledge that countries with nuclear powers are saying to others, do not let this escalate, do not expand this. We are all trying to work towards a position whereby international agreement, we can see multilateral disarmament. I don't see how you can possibly achieve that by just saying, take Trident, chuck it over the border somewhere, don't care where it goes, and that makes Scotland a safer place. That is utterly inane, ladies and gentlemen.
There's a serious question here. How does spending £100 billion on new nuclear weapons equate to disarmament, whether that's multilateral or unilateral? The choice we've got here in a couple of weeks is, do we want to be tied into £100 billion expenditure on nuclear weapons, or do we want to take the ability not to do that in Scotland so we can invest that money in better things, childcare, better public services, proper conventional defence?
Thank you. Right, there's so much to get through. We could talk about that all night, but there's so much to get through. Let's take our next question from Kirsty Mackay.
Would taxes rise in an independent Scotland?
Nicola Sturgeon.
There's absolutely no requirement as a result of Scotland becoming independent for taxes to rise.
No requirement, or would they?
And my party has no plans to increase taxes. Now, governments in an independent Scotland, as is the case in the UK just now, will take decisions on taxation in budgets on an annual basis, depending on the prevailing circumstances in the economy and depending on what their policies are. But, you know, the reason I can say confidently that taxes don't need to go up is that we're not subsidised in Scotland. Scotland. So all of the public services that we enjoy, whether that's our National Health Service or pensions or any other services that are provided in Scotland, are paid for by you and I. They're paid for out of our taxes right now. It's just that right now we pay the taxes, that money goes to London. London decides how much of it comes back to Scotland. They spend some of it on things like nuclear weapons. If we're independent, we keep the taxes here and we decide the priorities for the spending of our own resources.
Okay, let's
That's
point
the
that
benefit
to Jim
of
Murphy then.
Scotland contributes a huge amount to the UK Treasury in our income tax and taxes on business and taxes on oil. It's about £53 billion a year. I mean, a huge sum of money. But you know what? We get more than that back. £65 billion. Those aren't my figures, they're the independent figures, they're no political parties figures, the IFS figures. So £12 billion of additional investment here in Scotland. To break that down, it's £1,200 extra for every adult in Scotland in public services than the UK average.
But hang on a minute,
Now,
hang on a minute.
It's
quite important. I'm so sorry, it's quite important. What I want to put it to you is, I'm so sorry, but it's quite important. Because the question is, where is this money coming from? Scotland is 8.3% of the UK's population. With oil, it raised 9.1% of taxes. Is the problem here not that Scotland is subsidised by the rest of the UK, but that it, like the UK, is subsidised by debt?
No, we contribute 9.1 and we get 9.3 back, James. That's the truth. We contribute 9.1, we get 9.3 back. It's £1,200 a person more in public services in Scotland. So someone has to pay these bills. Now, what we're told by the Scottish National Party and Yes campaign is that vote for independence and everything will be free. The fact is that they're also saying taxes will be lower because they promised Brian and his friends and Tyler too that corporation tax will be lower. You cannot build a socialist utopia in an independent Scotland on tax rates lower than George Osborne would even promise in a Tory Britain. It's unachievable. The figures don't add up
so they would
in any way whatsoever.
So in a word, they would rise. Well, it's a question. You've finished. But would they rise?
The fact is, someone's going to have to pay these bills. Setting up a separate army, a separate navy, a separate air force, setting up a new tax system, a new pension system. Someone has to pay the costs of independence and separation. And we've absolutely no idea what the cost is because Nicola and her friends won't tell us the full cost of setting up a separate state.
Well, assuming Brian Souter is one of Nicola's friends, let's ask him.
Well, Brian, let's ask him. How much would it cost, Brian?
Well, I mean, this is just amazing. I don't know. Everyone, these numbers fly around all over the place, eh? And we've really got to ask the question, who do you trust about these numbers? Because let me tell you, I really don't trust where the source of a lot of these numbers are. And it's very interesting because do you trust Westminster and the numbers they are giving us? Because this is the same Westminster that used the Official Secrets Act to cover up the Macron report in 1979. A report which said that Scotland would be a very wealthy country, and they kept it secret for 30 years.
But Brian Souter, I'm sorry, but I don't think either side particularly disputes these figures. Their Office for National Statistics figures, some of them are collected by the Scottish Government, actually, Scottish Government figures. People don't dispute these figures. I mean, who are you saying is at it here?
Well, what I'm saying is, you know, a lot of the numbers that are used about how much oil will be produced, all the numbers that are flying around, we're all tired about hearing about all these different numbers. And Nicola's point, of course, is right. We're up to our backside in debt. And the reason why there are these differences, we're borrowing enormous numbers. But if you forecast forward the numbers for an independent Scotland without debt, then we're in surplus every year going forward. And if you look back 30 years, we have been in surplus over the 30-year period.
So you're reneging on the debt? So your argument would be Scotland should renege on its debt?
I am not saying we should...
Well, you said without debt.
I said I'm making the point that...
You can't say without... There's a huge debt. So the question is, there is a huge debt. But if Scotland takes it, the question is this, would taxes have to rise?
But James, we didn't accumulate that debt.
It doesn't matter, it's there.
Right? And the point is, if we take our share of the debt, we can still balance our budget in the medium term. In fact, we can balance our budget a lot faster than Westminster can balance their budget.
So tax rises in the short term, then?
No.
Why not?
John Sweeney has made it very clear. He set the budget out going forward. and he said what the borrowings would be and when we would get to break even. It's all in the white paper going forward, right? It's very clear.
Annabel Goldie wants to come in.
You know, listening to Brian's logic is like me saying, I've spent my whole life wanting to be a size 12. I'm still waiting to achieve that. Because when Brian talks about the figures, there are some very important figures, not least in the white paper. Because one page of the white paper was devoted to an illustration of what the finances of the first year of independence might be like. Now, the surprising thing was not that a budget deficit was brought out. We expected that. The surprising thing was how small the budget deficit was. And then it emerged that the oil revenues had been generously overestimated and the expenditure had been ambitiously underestimated, so your budget deficit was smaller. John Swinney, to his credit, recognised something would have to be done. He brought out amended oil revenue figures just 2 or 3 months ago. And in these, he said, OK, instead of my first year of independence producing revenues between 6.8 and 7.9, the first year will be £6.9 billion. And the second year will be £7.3 billion. Unfortunately for John, an advisor to the Scottish Government, Professor Hughes Hallett, said, no, my estimate is £2 billion less than that. And that is why, to go back to Kirsty's question about what awaits us in an independent Scotland and will taxes go up, Nicola and Brian can't tell you, because you can't tell this audience, because, Nicola, in honesty, you don't know. We know there will be budget deficit. We don't know what our currency will be.
Got a budget deficit.
We don't know what our currency will be. We know our budget deficit is going to be proportionally bigger, percentage of GDP than the rest of the UK. We know there's going to be a black hole. The Institute of Fiscal Studies estimates a £6 billion black hole and has said either that means taxes going up or cutting expenditure on public services. So if you're worried, Kirsty, you are right to be worried.
All right. Nicola Sturgeon is very, very keen to speak. I want to take 3 points from the audience and then we'll come back. So first of all, the man with the yellow lanyard around his neck. Yes.
Under SNP in Scotland, the SNP manages to pay everything through the block grant from the Barnett formula. So that's fine. But I can't take any facts about figures from Better Together, considering they're a coalition of the parties that put us into the worst financial mess we've seen since the end of the Second World War.
Thank you. The man on the edge, the man right on the edge, yes, the blue shirt.
Yes, I'd like to make the point that it wasn't so long ago that oil was $10 a barrel. And if the large part of the Scottish revenue is derived from oil, what happens to the taxation system, and what will be the first tax that rises when oil crashes again?
OK, and the woman in the front with the green jacket.
Hi, I just want to make the point that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if taxes go up. I think it's just about making sure that people understand why they're going up, what that money would be spent on, and relating that to things like the deficit and public services.
Because you think they should go up to fund changes?
It shouldn't. It's just that it's not about, you can't get anything for free. You get what you pay for. So as long as people have a really good understanding of what that tax would be used for, they've not necessarily against
Thank you. We'll come to the man at the front.
Well, the SNP has indicated that they expect, or they want university education to remain free, but surely if there's an influx of English students who would suddenly be considered English students, there would be a need for more money to cover that. So surely taxes would have to rise to cover things like that are not expenditures considered at the moment.
Let's try not get into the detail of education policy, but let's just try to come back to that point. I know you wanted to answer some of the points.
I wanted to pick up a point in particular that Jim made. Jim said that public spending in Scotland is £1,200 higher per head than it is across the rest of the UK. And he's right about that. But what Jim didn't tell you is that in the year he took that figure from, which I guess is 2011-12, the tax generated per head in Scotland was £1,700 higher than the rest of the UK. The No campaign are serial misleaders when it comes to Scotland's finances. This Better Together. This Better Together leaflet tries to tell us that an independent Scotland would be poorer than Pakistan. It insults your intelligence. And why are they seriously misleading? Because they know if they tell you the truth, that Scotland is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the 14th richest country in the world, you would start asking, why are we putting up with rising child poverty? Why are we putting up with rising demand for food banks? Why are we putting up with cuts
from a Tory government that we didn't vote for. And they know that you would conclude that it was actually better to take control of our own vast resources rather than have those resources controlled by a Tory government we don't vote for.
OK. I'll take a couple of points and then Jim Murphy. The woman with glasses, yes.
Independent Scotland proposes to set up an oil fund, but surely to set up the oil fund for the set-up costs and the running costs, will taxes not need to be increased?
Thank you. And we'll go to the man right in the middle in the blue shirt. Yeah.
Do we have lots of oil or lots and lots of oil? And isn't it more about how we spend the money rather than how much we have?
OK, Jim Murphy.
Well, first of all, for the SNP's figures to even come close to adding up in the white paper, they've had to assume an oil barrel price of $113. It's only been that high in 4 months in 2008, but they've taken the high point to work out all the sums. But you know, Nicola's point about poverty and food banks. I want rid of food banks in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Manchester and Liverpool. Poverty and hunger recognises no nationality. And I won't take any lectures from Nicola and the SNP. When the Labour government was introducing the national minimum wage, the dignity of a national minimum wage, not one single SNP MP turned up to vote to introduce that legislation. But yet, when Labour tries to introduce a national living wage in the Scottish Parliament, every single SNP MSP turned up to vote that down. Spare us the lectures about social justice, Nicola.
She said it wasn't true.
Sort of thing is offered. And as for the...
Well, hang on, she's been in that conversation. All right, go on, and then we'll come to Nicola Sturgeon.
And as for this idea that the SNP have been open and honest, do you know, they've had 8 decades as a party. They've had 7 years as a government and 2 years in this campaign, and they still can't tell us what currency we're going to be using if we're an independent country.
Well, sorry, the answer to that question is the pound. But anyway, back to the living wage. Back to the living wage. The reason the Scottish Government couldn't introduce the living wage through the procurement bill is because European law says you're not allowed to have a living wage mandated that's higher than your minimum wage. We don't control the minimum wage in Scotland. If we were independent, we'd control the minimum wage, and we could ensure that the minimum wage rose at least in line with inflation, unlike under the Westminster parties where it's fallen behind the cost of living. And you know what? Maybe over time we could get the minimum wage up to the level of the living wage as well, but we need the powers to do it first.
Well, hang on. Yes, Annabel Goldie. Annabel Goldie. Just
Nicola,
very quickly, and then we'll go to Annabel.
This scare story about Europe, you sound more like UKIP than the SNP. I mean, it's an absolute fiction. The fact is on the currency, just finally...
Quickly, because I'd like to take a point for Annabel Goldie.
The First Minister of Wales has said an independent Scotland wouldn't be able to share a currency with Wales if Scotland becomes independent. This isn't about Scotland versus England. It's about control of your economy, about an ability to make your own decisions in your own country. The idea that we would be independent, keep the pound and rely on the Bank of England, that would allow a foreign bank in a foreign country to set your mortgage rates, your car loan rates, your interest card rates. What's the logic of that? We would have absolutely no control over our economy.
Right, OK, there's 4 on the panel. There's 4 on the panel, so let's take some more contributions from the outside. Brian Souter first of all.
We are getting the same rhetoric all the time from Better Together, and we have to say it just doesn't pass the common sense test. That's the reality of it. You know, I travelled last week in 3 different countries. I didn't need a passport. Everyone knows you can travel right across Europe using the same currency. Are you suggesting that France isn't independent because it has a central European bank that it's accountable to? I mean, this is just ridiculous logic here. I mean, I think we're now seeing through the scaremongering. You know, and by the way, it's not just senior cabinet members that are saying, of course, there will be a currency union. I've spoken to a number of backbenchers at Westminster, and they all say the same thing. There will be a currency union.
Who, Brian?
They're good friends, and I can't disclose them, but it's a
from which parties? From which parties?
From the Conservative Party.
How many?
I've spoken to at least one.
So 1 then?
Yeah.
Right, Annabel Goldie.
So 1 Tory has told you this, Brian.
Annabel
was his
Goldie.
name Carswell, but never mind. I'm just going to say, Nicola's talking about very worthy aspirations. I understand that, and she says we need the levers. Going back to Kirsty's question, no, Kirsty, we need the money. because everything that Nicola wants costs money. And going back to your questions about the likely stability of the economy in an independent Scotland, from all the facts we've been able to gather, Brian, from the white paper, look at it, page 75. That's the starting point. We know that there's going to be ongoing budget deficit. And when challenged about that, Alex Salmond actually had the sense to admit, yes, there would be ongoing budget deficit, but he said we would work our way out of that by expanding the workforce. That's what we'd do. We'd rely on immigration to expand the workforce and contribute to productivity. But someone else calculated you'd need to have a net migration of 24,000 people coming in and staying every year for a period of 20 years, ladies and gentlemen. That's a population the size of Edinburgh.
I would quite like to...
That's going to take time to address this budget deficit. And in the interim, either public expenditure is cut or taxes go up.
I would quite like to ask Kirsty, who originally asked this question, what she makes of all of this. It seems like 100 years ago now. Would taxes rise in an independent Scotland? Kirsty, what do you think?
I don't really mind if taxes rise, because I would know that my taxes are going back into the country that I vote for, the government that I vote for. So I wouldn't really mind if it rises.
So you're going to vote yes, if I don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I'm voting yes.
And you're voting yes, but you'd be happy to see your taxes rise. Do you think they will?
I don't know if that's what my question was for.
Do you think you've got anywhere?
Not really.
Well, that was a waste of time. Right, let's move on then. Marjorie Johnson has the next question. Let's go to Marjorie Johnson. And just before we come to you, Marjorie, just to remind people that you can join tonight's debate on Twitter using the BBC IndieRef hashtag or text us on 80295. You can also email referendumdebate@bbc.co.uk and go to the BBC News website to see a selection of your comments. On you go.
Does the prospect of a strengthened UKIP presence in Westminster pose more risk to Scotland than independence would?
Annabel Goldie.
At the end of the day, Marjorie, who emerges in Westminster, who emerges from Scotland? Scotland elected a UKIP MEP, remember, depends on voters. I think what's very clear to me is that there are many voters throughout the United Kingdom who don't agree with UKIP, don't support what it stands for, don't feel it's a party of any influence, don't feel it's in a position to deliver anything. And therefore, I think the greater threat, I must be quite honest, to Scotland is the uncertainty currently being caused by the prospect of independence. And you know, an uncertainty we saw reflected in the money markets with the pound's value slipping because of the recent opinion poll. That's not politicians at work. That's money markets at work, saying we're assessing the situation, don't like it. Now, I think there is a real difficulty for us. I've made clear I think there's a real difficulty if we vote for separation and independence, because I think there's risk, I think there's uncertainty, and I just feel we don't have to take that risk on. We don't have to. We know what we've got. We've got a good set-up in the partnership of the UK. We've got a good set-up with the Scottish Parliament, a Parliament that will get more powers. That is the best of both worlds. Let's keep it. Let's not take on unnecessary risk.
Brian Souter, are you worried about UKIP?
I don't lay awake at night worrying about UKIP, I have to say that. But I think there is a lesson about UKIP that the mainstream parties have to really sit up and pay attention to. I think the reason that UKIP are doing so well in England is that there is complete disillusionment with Westminster. There are big issues about integrity with expense scandals. Now we hear there's a sex abuse scandal. And I think people are very disillusioned with Westminster politics. And one of the things I think is very interesting about this debate is that a lot of people who haven't been engaged up to now in this, and I spoke to someone this afternoon that hadn't voted for 30, just one person.
The same person?
And I can name her, because she's Susan and she's a cleaner. And she said to me, I haven't voted for 30 years, but I'm voting this time, because this time my vote can make a difference. And for the last 30 years, my vote couldn't.
OK. On the question, if we have points on the question, which was, does the prospect of a strengthened UKIP presence at Westminster provide more risk to Scotland than independence? Yes, the woman here.
My response is just to Annabel Goldie discussing certainty. Last week, the UK Prime Minister was asked a very simple question. What devolved powers would be given to Scotland in the event of a no vote, and when? He said yes and soon. What is certain about that?
OK, let's try to stay on UKIP for a minute, because that's what we're trying to have a discussion about. And yes, the woman at the back.
I'd just like to remind us all of the warnings we received at the start of this referendum period, when we were told that all the uncertainty that would be created by that would drive businesses out and would have a negative effect on the economy. Living in Aberdeen, anybody living in Aberdeen cannot fail to notice the amount of building that's going on throughout the city and the numbers of large businesses that are investing here, the numbers of large headquarters that are being based in Aberdeen, and the number of houses.
And in the context of UKIP, is it concerning for you that the UK might, for example, be heading for the European Union exit, and that might affect that, or what?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And at the front.
I completely dispute the points that was made up there about youth not being involved or having an interest in politics, when I actually completely disagree with this, because a lot of the youths that don't have an interest in politics, it's because their mother or father has mass political apathy. And the reason for that is because the political apathy is coming from politics perhaps not being as accessible as it should be for perhaps lower class, working class people who have not studied perhaps a degree at university, or even studied after school, or even stayed their whole time in school.
Thank you very much for the point. Thank you. Let's come back to the question in terms of not just UKIP, but Europe in general, and where Britain or Scotland might be heading. Nicola Sturgeon.
I don't think we should take the risk of even another Tory government that we didn't vote for, because even that, I think, presents a real risk to Scotland's future in Europe. We could find ourselves, after an in-out referendum, taken out of Europe against our will. So I think that's a big enough risk. When you add UKIP into that, frankly, it becomes pretty terrifying. I don't want a Tory UKIP government running my country, and that is a real prospect. Now, I think that the key democratic argument for Scotland being independent is this one. If we're independent, we decide who governs us. If we're not independent, then we continue to be at the mercy of how general elections across the UK go. Every single general election in my lifetime has been won by Labour, but for more than half my life, we've had Tory governments and Tory Prime Ministers. That's not democratic. Today we've seen former Tory Secretaries of State for Scotland, Ian Lang, Malcolm Rifkin, Michael Forsyth, urging us to vote no. Frankly, they're the lieutenants of Margaret Thatcher. They gave us the poll tax. They're a living embodiment of the reason to vote yes.
Okay, Annabel Goldie briefly, and then we'll come to Jim Murphy.
As is so often the case with the Yes campaign, you're given a lot of rhetoric without any facts to actually back up what's been said. Since the Second World War, there have been 18 governments elected at Westminster. Okay? Out of these 18, on 13 occasions, Scotland has got the government she voted for. On only 11 occasions has South of England got the government it voted for.
Well, that's not a very good state of affairs, is it?
But people accept. But Nicola is implying the system is broken. But Nicola is implying that somehow Scotland is being shortchanged, and that's why we need out of the UK.
And Scotland and England being shortchanged.
My point is that democracy within the partnership of the United Kingdom means sometimes you will get the government you want, sometimes you won't. It's not a reason to reject a strong partnership.
Yeah. Jim Murphy.
Nicola and the SNP can rightly bemoan Mrs Thatcher coming to power, but older viewers who remember those years will remember how Mrs Thatcher came to power. It was the SNP siding with the Tories that brought down that Labour government and brought Mrs Thatcher to power. Now, on the point about young people, the lady at the front, I'm doing the debate with 12,000 young people at the Hydro next week in Glasgow, so I think to get 12,000 youngsters to the Hydro for something that's not a concert but a political debate shows that politics is alive and well. We were out in Glasgow at a pizza restaurant, and I can't name it on the BBC, but there was a hen do next to us, and they were all drinking tequilas, and they were well worn, and they were debating the merits of a currency union. Now, they just agreed to get drunk rather than come to an agreement, but nevertheless, that shows you how powerful this debate has been. But on the point about UKIP, which was Marjorie's original point, look, we shouldn't pretend that Scotland is the most welcoming nation on earth. That politics of cultural conceit, we shouldn't pretend. The fact is, London didn't vote for a UKIP MEP, but Scotland did. The fact that Scotland has been stained through the generations from occasional racism and a sectarianism that scarred our soul, and we shouldn't pretend the country hasn't been, and unfortunately in some cases is still like that. But the question for Marjorie is, should Scotland be worried about it? I think who should be worried about UKIP? It's David Cameron. The Tories are in meltdown yet again over Europe, and it highlights again that David Cameron is temporary. He can be gone in just a few short months. Independence is forever, and it's an enormous risk. So let's vote. Okay. Let's vote to stay in the UK this month, and let's vote to kick David Cameron out next year.
Brian Souter.
I just say, I agree with Jim that we're enjoying the debate, but can I just remind everyone that you folks didn't want us to have this debate in the first place? This is about bringing democracy closer to the people. And if we do get a yes vote, able people like Jim will then be fielded into the Scottish Parliament. So I want a yes vote so we can liberate you for the future.
OK. Let's take a point from the man in green. Yeah.
I'd like to ask Nicola Sturgeon how important she feels that a written constitution would be in an independent Scotland.
OK, let's try and stick to topic, if that's all right. We'll come to the man in the middle with a check shirt. Yeah.
I really just want to comment on the always getting what you vote for. I think Jim Murphy made it clear 10% of the Scottish population voted for UKIP. 37% of the Scottish population voted for either the Tories or UKIP in the last election. Whatever constituency you are, you will always have to make some compromise. You will always lose elections. You will always win elections. If I had a vote in my own house, I wouldn't normally win it. I would normally lose it 2-1. If you cut any constituency small enough, you'll get what you vote for. I think the lady across here said, it's OK, I'll pay more tax because I know what I vote for will be the party in power. Okay, no, it won't. It will just be one of the other parties in power. Sure. And I can also say...
Quickly.
Scotland is 10% of the UK electorate. It would be 1% of a European electorate. If you think you're going to get more power from your 1% of a European electorate or 10% of the UK electorate.
Yeah, thank you. And the man with glasses, two or three rows back. Yeah.
Annabel mentioned the South East of England, not getting who they vote for. Jim's kind of mentioned London. That chap there's mentioned areas as well. Are these people suggesting that Scotland is comparable to these areas? Because Scotland's a country. That's why we can say Scotland doesn't get who it votes for. It's a country, and we don't get who we vote for. These are areas of a country.
It's a fair point, Annabel Goldie, isn't it? Is there not a difference?
It's in the context of the partnership with the United Kingdom. Now, obviously, some of the audience reject that partnership, find no merit in it, and, you know, I respect that view. I don't agree with it, but I'm simply pointing out it's a rather bogus argument to say, tritely on every occasion, oh, we don't get the governments we vote for. I'm pointing out, if you accept the partnership as merit and you believe the partnership should continue, then sometimes you will get the government you vote for in Scotland. More often than not, you will. Sometimes you won't. That's democracy.
OK, let's... Nicola Sturgeon quickly, and then we'll get to the next one.
Two quick points. I mean, Jim says vote no and then vote to kick out David Cameron. The truth is, every single one of us in Scotland could vote Labour, and we still wouldn't get a Labour government if England voted Tory. And my second point was actually agree with Brian. Jim and I are on opposite sides of this debate. I'd love to see Jim in the Scottish Parliament. I think he's a really quality politician, and I've never voted Labour, so I can't pretend my motivation for independence is the fortunes of the Scottish Labour Party. But you know what? See, if I was a Labour supporter, I'd see real merit in Scotland being independent. I'd see it as a way to reclaim my party, because if the Scottish Labour Party becomes independent, people like Jim come back, and the Scottish Labour Party get to be true to its own ideals, not looking over its shoulder at Westminster. So if you're a Labour supporter, perhaps the best future for your own party is to vote yes.
People are offering you all kinds of exciting things. Yeah. If Scotland votes for independence, it must sound quite tempting for you.
I've been offered everyone's job apart from yours, isn't it?
So I'll give it time. It's only, nearly there.
This point about Labour politics and Labour values and Labour vision, the Labour Party is formed with a sense of solidarity, the idea that we are stronger together and we would be weaker apart. And I believe in trade unions at work. The trade union movement founded the Labour Party. Joining a trade union at work can make you better paid, can make you safer, can make you more influential. And I believe in trade unions at work, and I believe in a social union on these islands. I don't believe in the politics of cultural conceit. The idea that changing your nationality solves all of our problems, because changing your passport has never put a penny in the pocket of the purse of a poor person anywhere in the world. And I care as much about a family that are hungry, a family that are out of work, whether in Aberdeen, Liverpool or Glasgow. And I don't believe in the sense of social solidarity, that it's an expression of that solidarity that you walk away and say that you're on your own. Let's work to change our whole country, these islands. Let's make a fairer nation. Let's get rid of the Tories into the bargain. And let's not take the enormous risk with the uncosted sense of independence being promised by Nicola and the SNP.
Thank you very much. Let's take another question. Let's go to our next question now, which comes from Patience Shell. Patience Shell.
What's better for higher education, independence or the union?
Brian Souter.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. What's better for higher education, independence or staying in the union?
Well, I think it's a very straightforward answer to that. If you want to continue with free education, then you need to vote for independence. And it's really elementary. Our vision for a new Scotland is so different from what is happening in the Westminster Parliament in so many areas. And if you look at it over the last 35 years, we've pumped our oil revenues to Westminster in this better together concept. And what have we got out of this deal in return? We've ended up with the poll tax, the bedroom tax. We've ended up with a nuclear arsenal just outside our biggest city. Doesn't seem like a great deal to me. And I think if we're going to sustain free education, then the only realistic way of doing it is to pull the levers that we have ourselves, take control, take the levers of the economy, which we need to do this. And it's interesting, this idea about what is your vision for Scotland? How are we going to deliver this? And Annabel's point, how are we going to pay for this? And the answer to that is simple. The reason why there's a 3% corporation tax cut in this is not to help rich people. It's to create 30,000 jobs and attract a whole lot of companies to locate in Scotland, because that's good for us. And our vision is that we want to create a dynamic economy where entrepreneurs can operate and generate wealth in Scotland, and then we want to distribute that wealth and deal with the social justice issues and take the 200,000 children we have in poverty. If you want to make these decisions, if you sign up to that vision, you will never fulfil it as long as we are stuck in the Westminster system.
So the question was whether independence or staying in the UK is better for higher education. The woman in orange, please.
Isn't education already devolved to Scotland through the Scottish Government? And so we've already got that. We don't need to be an independent country to have control over our education.
OK, we'll take a couple more. The man, in the second row back, yes.
Nicola, can you guarantee that higher education will be free in independent Scotland?
OK, we'll come to that in a minute, and we'll go further up the back here to the man in glasses with his hand very high in the air. Yes.
Yeah, I've got long arms. Just listen to Brian Souter there. I come from Linlithgow. I went to school in the 60s in Linlithgow. First in my family to get to university. In my street, 20 council houses, 10 kids went to the first time to university in their families, and I got paid for them. When my dad died, I got a grant. There was no loans. Now there's student loans. And the lady down there is correct. Brian Souter, education has been devolved in Scotland. There's not going to be any difference between being devolved and independent, but what will happen in independence is we'll have to find out how to fund these English students, and there's going to be big cuts in grants if you listen to Professor Pennington speaking.
OK, Nicola Sturgeon.
Directly to the lady here and to the gentleman who's just spoken, education policy is devolved. That's why we've got free education in Scotland. What we don't control is the size of our budget, and our budget's been cut by 7% over the last few years. George Osborne has told us there's £25 billion more of cuts coming. So if we want to protect the things that really matter to us, including free education, then we need to control our budget, and we only get that with independence. I get quite passionate, as I know lots of people do when I'm talking about free education, because it's really personal for me. I grew up in a working class family. I had the privilege of a university education. I know that if I'd had to pay tuition fees, I wouldn't have been able to go to university, not because my mum and dad wouldn't have done everything in their power to send me, but it wouldn't have been possible. And I feel so strongly that having had that privilege as a politician now and able to sit here partly because of that free education, I've got no right to pull that ladder of opportunity up behind me. And I'll never be part of anything in politics that takes that away. Now, you'll hear, and we've heard reference to this, that that if we become independent, we won't be able to protect that because we'll have to give free education to students coming from England. Let me say, first of all, I don't want to charge anybody to go to university, wherever they come from. But we have to do that now, and we would have to continue to do it because Westminster has imposed sky-high tuition fees in the rest of the UK. If only 10% of students from England came to Scotland to take advantage of free education, that would take up 80% of our places. Now, the issue of European law has been raised, and it will be raised again. You can make an objective justification to justify something that would otherwise be against European law. That's what we will do for the reasons that I've just set out. And that's why, sir, I can say to you that if my party is in government, we will always protect free education because it is one of the most important things any government can ever protect.
Jim Murphy.
Well, coming directly to Patience's question and the gentleman from Linlithgow's point, we have still got far too much inequality in our country. Here in Scotland, under devolution, the fact is that there's too many families who still struggle. Those who go out to work still struggle. What's the most important journey that anyone ever makes in their life? The most important journey you ever make in life is from the labour ward in which you were born to your first home. Because that determinant of class, that short journey, has such a remarkable influence on your diet, your education, your income, your earnings, where you study. And surely we want a world where people don't inherit that sense of poverty, material or emotional poverty. So really this sense of how do you pay for all of these things? How do you create a more just society? We all want a system where no matter where you're born, you have equal opportunity to progress in life, like the gentleman said there from Linlithgow. But when we're being offered a set of economics that's so based on oil, the fact is that oil revenues fell by over £4 billion in just 1 year. That's the entire... There's no point booing, ladies and gentlemen. It's a fact. Oil revenues fell by £4 billion in 1 year. That's the equivalent of the entire Scottish schools budget. Now, that's an enormous risk. And the final point is a risk we don't have to take, because we have devolution already. We can have free tuition fees here in Scotland already. The best of both worlds. A strong Scottish Parliament with more powers coming, but without having to leave the United Kingdom to help make that happen.
Let's go to the man in blue. Yeah.
Nicola just promised this, that we wouldn't see rises in tuition fees or tuition fees at all in Scotland. Can you make the same promise for us if we were to stick with devolution?
Can you, in one word?
The promise is, the fact is that's an issue of politics. Each of the political parties will say at the next Scottish election what their priorities will be. So this is again, is not...
What does your party say?
Our party will set out our manifesto at the next election. This is much more important than one manifesto or one election. Hold on.
And it's not an issue, it's not an issue of nationality. I want to hear more audience members. Thank you. The woman, in the blue and white top. Yes.
Nicola, you're saying that in order to block the English students from being able to come up here to get the free education, does that mean when you implement the block, it also affect the... or implement whatever you want to do with an EU law, will automatically block all the rest of the EU countries students coming into this country that actually generate an income?
Yeah, the question is,
taking up part-time labour.
If you're not charging other EU countries, if you're going to charge the English, don't you have to charge everyone else?
Can I just say, first of all, we're not blocking people coming out. I want students to come from England to study here. We're seeing an increase in students from England coming here. That's great, but we have to protect places for our own students. Most other European countries don't charge the tuition fees that are charged in England. I mean, in Germany, they're getting rid of tuition fees in the land that still have tuition fees. So this is about a policy that is imposed on us because of Westminster's decision to impose tuition fees. And I thought it was very telling there that Jim couldn't give you a guarantee that even a Labour government in the devolved Parliament wouldn't introduce tuition fees. And I hope everybody heard that, because if I was a young person right now, that would worry me greatly.
OK, thanks very much. I'll come to you in just a second. First of all, the woman right at the back. Yes.
They say it's all about how we're going to pay for everything, like education. If we're in charge of our economy, if we're in charge of all our revenues, we can make all the decisions about how we spend the money in Scotland We don't have to spend it on Trident. We can have free education. We can have a good NHS.
Thank you. Point at the front.
We're talking a lot about education, but higher education is not just about teaching, it's also about research that is done to promote that teaching. And there's been a lot of conversation in the last few days about how potentially there could be a funding gap in case the UK Research Council and the likes will stop funding Scottish university research. How will that... Does the SNP essentially have a plan B in case that is...
I need to come to Annabel Goldie. We've taken the point. I need to come to Annabel Goldie very briefly, if you would.
Yeah, Patience's original question was not actually about free education. It was, what is higher education going to face, either through independence or remaining within the United Kingdom? And this young gentleman's raised a very important point, because we do know that at the moment, Patience, we are getting from UK research monies 13% of these monies, which is higher than our population share would merit. I know university principals regard that as very important and very significant. I also know that within academia there is concern about the viability of our continued funding of higher education. So, you know, Nicola brays about Jim not having a policy. These are devolved issues. This has nothing to do with constitutional change. University education is devolved. When we have a Scottish Parliament election, you can look at the slate of policies, make your own mind up and vote for the parties you want, you know, ignore the parties you don't want.
Quick point from the man on the edge, and then we'll come to Nicola Sturgeon to respond.
Well, on the question of funding for research, I wrote to all of the parties on this to find out what the position on it is. And I'm afraid what Annabel Goldie has just said doesn't agree with what the reply I got from the Conservative Party about it. The point is that in the UK, we have the lowest, or amongst the lowest, percentage GDP investment directly into scientific research from the government of any developed country. And that's quite shocking.
OK, thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, we do well out of UK research funding because we've got some of the best researchers doing the best research, and that's not going to change. It's about a third of research funding that comes from the UK research councils. But can I just say, we're in Aberdeen just now. The principal of Robert Gordon University wrote an article in The Guardian yesterday where he said he didn't think independence was any threat at all to research funding or to the quality of research. So he's presumably one of the experts that you're talking about, and that's his view, and I think that counts for an awful lot.
All right, thank you. Jim Murphy, you literally have 10 seconds, no more.
This is entirely wishful thinking. The idea that the rest of the United Kingdom, which would then be a foreign country to Scotland, will continue to fund research in an independent Scotland is fanciful. Okay. It's right out the same drawer that says the Royal Navy will continue to build warships in the River Clyde and Rosyth. It's just entire wishful thinking, and we can't put livelihoods, the funding of universities or shipbuilding jobs across Scotland at risk just because the SNP tell you it's all going to be all right tonight. Let's not worry.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Our hour is up. Our final programme will be in Stirling on the 14th, the last Sunday before the referendum. Our panel will include the actor and independence campaigner Elaine C. Smith and Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary Douglas Alexander, among others. But for now, my thanks to our panel and to our audience here, and from the Music Hall in Aberdeen, good night.